This time Stark, and in this video we are looking at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So first of all we need to look at the causes of a crisis in Afghanistan. As in April 1978, a coup in Afghanistan led to the overthrow of Mohammad Daoud Khan. And while Khan was part of the PDPA, which is the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, his fellow PDPA associates overthrew him because of his failure to implement the socialist principles that he had committed to. So Khan's murder meant that Nur Mohammad Taraki came to power, and in December 1978, the Soviets signed a 20-year friendship treaty in which Soviet economic and military aid flowed into Afghanistan. However, Soviet aid was unable to stabilize the country, and Taraki instigated a radical program of modernization aiming to eradicate illiteracy, uphold women's rights, and promote secularism over Islam. But Taraki's government was also based upon a dictatorship and brutality against opposing groups, and this led to much hostility among the conservatives in the country. But in March 1979, a violent uprising occurred in Afghanistan, and Taraki appealed to the Soviets for help. But the Politburo were reluctant to send in troops because of worry that détente with the US could collapse, the USSR could be cast as an aggressor, and it would extend tensions for Muslims in Soviet Central Asia. So in September 1979, Taraki was brutally murdered by the other faction within the PDPA, and this was led by Hafizullah Amin. And Hafizullah Amin was unreliable as an ally, and he was unable to control the growing Islamic opposition that he was facing within Afghanistan. There was also a worry that Amin would realign Afghanistan with the US, Pakistan and China, and this would mean that the Soviets could lose their strategic, ideological, political and economic influence in Afghanistan. So now we need to look at the Soviet interests in Afghanistan, because for one, there was a shared border stretching 2,500 kilometers, and this adjoined the Muslim Central Asian republics of the USSR. Afghanistan was also a socialist state and an ally of the USSR, and if they aligned with the USA, this would strengthen the geostrategic power of the USA at the expense of the USSR. So this meant that Brezhnev saw the protection of Afghanistan as a security necessity, and this was because Afghanistan was part of the Soviet buffer zone. The Soviets also viewed an attack of Afghanistan as being consistent of the basic principles of détente agreed in 1972 and discussed in my last video. And this was because the US had never had influence in Afghanistan, and the Soviets were simply upholding the status quo rather than destroying it. So once the Soviets realized that Afghanistan was slipping away from their grasp, they decided that an invasion was the only option. And the decision was backed by the Soviet Defense Minister, Dmitry Ustinov, the chief of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, and the Politburo member in charge of ideology, Mikhail Shushlov. And the ailing Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev gave his sign-off for an invasion because he was told that it would be over within 3 or 4 weeks. So this meant that on the 24th of December 1979, large numbers of Soviet airborne troops landed in Kabul, and within 3 days they had taken over strategic installations in the capital, stormed the presidential palace and killed Hafizullah Amin, and replaced him with the Soviet loyalist Babrak Karmel. However, low morale and a high desertion rate among Afghan forces meant that the Soviet soldiers would have to do most of the fighting, and this meant that by the end of 1980, there were more than 125,000 Soviet military personnel in Afghanistan. But the Soviet opposition were the Mujahideen, and while the Soviets controlled the cities, the Mujahideen controlled the countryside. And their ambushes and sabotage traps, and the fact that the Americans were supplying them with weapons, were too strong for the Soviet Union, whose economic might was not enough to cope in the mountainous terrain. So the settlement was finally agreed in Geneva in 1988, and the Soviets pledged to withdraw their troops. They had lost 15,000 soldiers, 50,000 were wounded, and 10,000 were left disabled. But the psychological impact was also vast, as many of the soldiers returned with the Afghan syndrome, and this meant that they were unable to shake off the horrors of the war. In Afghanistan, over 1 million were killed, and after the Soviet withdrawal, they broke out into civil war. So the USA reaction to Afghanistan was also very interesting, as the events in Afghanistan gained even more significance when in Afghanistan's neighbouring country Iran, the Shah's pro-American regime was overthrown by the anti-American Islamic fundamentalists led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And Khomeini turned Iran into an Islamic fundamentalist republic, and he executed thousands of his opponents. But despite Khomeini's anti-American stance, the Americans feared that Khomeini's regime would collapse and that Iran would be vulnerable to communism. So this meant that the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan gained greater significance. So President Carter referred to the Soviet invasion as a flagrant breach of international protocol and a significant threat to international peace. And in a message to Brezhnev, he claimed that the invasion could mark a fundamental and long-lasting turning point in our relations. Weeks later, he said that the Soviet invasion was the most serious threat to peace since the Second World War. So Carter reacted by formally asking the US Senate to postpone any further consideration of the SALT II negotiations. And on the 4th of January 1980, Carter set out further measures aimed at the Soviet Union. So these included a deferral of action on cultural and economic exchanges, a ban on the sale of high technology and strategic items to the Soviets, US military and economic assistance to Pakistan to improve their security, major restrictions on Soviet fishing privileges in American waters, and an embargo on the sale of grain. The next year, the US further signalled its displeasure by boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics. But on 23rd of January 1980, Carter introduced his Carter Doctrine, and this initiated a commitment to prevent any further Soviet advance into the Persian Gulf area and Southwest Asia. And it emphasized the importance of a potential military reaction, and it applied additional pressure upon the USSR by strengthening their relationship with China. So Carter also attempted to persuade the NATO alliance to suspend European détente, yet they were not prepared to do this. And whilst they were disgusted with the Soviet invasion, Europe's trade with the USSR not only continued, but it in fact expanded. But in 1981, Carter announced an increase in the defense budget, in which $1.2 trillion would be spent on military exercises in the next 5 years. The Soviet Union saw this US response as a piece of international opportunism rather than as a response to the Soviet aggression. However, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan did signal the final blow to détente, and it meant that the US moved away from the Nixon-Kissinger methods of cooperation and reverted back to a position of containment, which some have termed the Second Cold War. So thank you for watching this video, and see you soon. Bye.